Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Ingrid Gerstmann, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. I'd like to welcome you to our book talk, Grand Strategy from Truman to Trump, with Dr. Benjamin Miller, University of Haifa, and moderated by Jack Snyder. Jack Snyder is the Robert and Renée Belfer Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science and a member of the Saltzman Institute's Executive Committee. He is the author or editor, by my count, Jack, of 8 books. I think. Is that right? And he has written on topics such as preventing war atrocities, democratization and war, imperial overstretch, international relations theory after September 11th, and his articles have appeared in the American Political Science Review, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Organization, International Security, and World Politics. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we're delighted to have him with us here today. Take it away, Jack.
Thanks, Ingrid, for the opportunity to introduce my old buddy, Benny Miller, who we've rubbed elbows many times at conferences and whatnot. And of course, I've spent years and years reading Benny's excellent writings on international politics. Benny's the professor of international relations in the School of Political Science and the head of the National Security Center at the University of Haifa. Benny also has a long string of books and articles under his belt. The one he'll talk about today is Grand Strategy from Truman to Trump, which has the most incredible list of dignitaries on the back of the book, blurbing the book, calling it bold and provocative, savvy and sweeping and ambitious, just to grab a few of the adjectives off the back cover, put there by John Mearsheimer, Peter Fever, Jack Levy, Bill Walforth, and a cast of other famous IR scholars who loved this book that we're going to hear about. I should say that although I'm a fan of many of Benny's writings, I'm particularly a fan of his work on the relationship between states and nations as a problem in international politics. For example, his book, States, Nations, and Great Powers, The Sources of Regional War and Peace, Cambridge University Press, 2007. Those of you who have delved into the literature on nationalism at all know that the go-to definition of nationalism in social science is that of Ernest Gellner, which defines nationalism as the doctrine that the state and the nation should be congruent. But what Benny has done is talked about all the terrible stuff that happens when you don't have a good match between the state and the nation. These insights are really profound and basic. And so if you haven't read Benny on that subject, as soon as you're finished reading the Grand Strategy book, go out and also read the States and Nations book. Some other interesting things about Benny. He got his PhD from UC Berkeley back when Ken Waltz was there. The preface to the book grand strategy book has an interesting discussion of the impact of Ken Waltz on Benny's thinking, and traces out in nice detail how the Waltz style of analysis affected his reasoning in the grand strategy book. Benny has taught at Hebrew University, at Duke, at University of Colorado, Princeton, and Dartmouth. And he also served for many years as the president of the Israeli Association for International Studies. Benny, way to go contributing to the field. Okay, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the grand strategy book. So I will get out of the way and hand the microphone to Benny. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's a great honor, and I'm really delighted to be in the War and Peace Institute, such a world-famous institute. And I benefited a lot from dialogue with Jack over the years, including in recent months, and you know, with research proposals and papers and so on. So it's really a great honor that he is chairing this event. Okay, so I will present in a few words something general about the book, the puzzle, and so on, and then move to a number of PowerPoints that hopefully clarify the key contribution, the key elements of the book. The research question I'm addressing in this book is how best to explain key changes in grand strategy. There are a number of puzzles in general, and maybe particularly applicable to the United States, that kind of got me interested in this subject. One is under what condition a liberal power will endorse a realist grand strategy, and when realist factors will lead to a liberal grand strategy. Because indeed, during the Cold War, we see a liberal power behaves in a realist way. While in the post-Cold War era, we can notice that realist conditions make the United States behave liberally. Then, in the last few years, we saw the emergence of nationalist America First, the Trumpist grand strategy. And we all know, we're all familiar more or less with the domestic, economic, social explanation of that rise. The question that I'm trying to address towards the end of the book is, what are the effects of the international system? To what extent the international system and changes in the international system can contribute to our understanding of the rise of this America First grand strategy. And finally, for the future, about the Biden grand strategy, what kind of the changes in the international context, international system can lead us to expect about the key changes in Biden's grand strategy. More generally, let me please place my argument in kind of two major debates in international relations. One is the material versus ideational, and the second one is the level of analysis question. About the material versus the ideational, my argument is that whereas there is a kind of an ideational debate about what is the best way to maximize national security, in the case of the United States, to maximize American security, this ideation, and these are autonomous ideas and debates of the participants in this debate, but then my argument is that actually material factors broker this debate and select one of the grand strategies to be dominant, at least for a while, until there is another change in the key international systemic factor, particularly distribution of capabilities and the balance of threat. And then about the level of analysis, most studies trying to account for grand strategy in general, for foreign policy in particular, and for American grand strategy, focus usually on the individual level of analysis, obviously, psychological elements, worldview of the president and his advisors, small group dynamics, and all of that, or on domestic politics, the socio-economic factor, the type of regime, parties, Congress, and executive relation, and all of that. And that makes a lot of sense. But I'm trying to highlight the effects of the international system, that the international level makes a major contribution to our understanding, particularly of key change in the grand strategy over time. And without that, we are losing a lot of explanatory power. What I'm going to do next is to do a share screen with a number of PowerPoints. And I will show the following PowerPoint. The first one will present kind of the dependent variables, namely a classification of 4 major grand strategy. What is their logic, and what are the objectives and the means of each grand strategy, each competing grand strategy. Then I will show the explanatory element, under what conditions each one of these grand strategy is going to dominate the foreign policy of the state, of this one, and then applying it historically to the United States since in 1945, and especially looking at the key changes. And my argument will be that many of the changes take place within the administration, rather than only when the new administration obviously comes to power with different worldview, ideology, ideas, political, and so on. But actually, many of the changes take place within because of changes in the international system. Then my goal would be to present the Trumpist grand strategy, in contrast to the realist and liberal grand strategy that usually dominate American foreign policy. And particularly to show the international effects and the rise of America first. And finally, to kind of point out potential changes in the Biden grand strategy beyond obviously the question of ideology and rhetoric and style, which will be completely different from Trump, there's no question about that, but also how do the international changes, the international context might affect a potential Biden's grand strategy. So let me start now with the presenting the classification. Okay, so I will open it further. Okay, so these are the 4 key grand strategies of the book before we move to the nationalist America First and the challenges it poses. Basically, the idea of a grand strategy is that there are objectives vis-a-vis the adversary, and the means of the policy, particularly, obviously, the key issue is the use of force, under what conditions to use force, and what levels of use of force. With regard to the objectives, the key distinction is between a focus on the balance of capabilities with the rival. And these are the realist grand strategy that obviously focus on this question of the balance of power, balance capabilities, versus grand strategies that focus on what I call ideology promotion. The idea here is that even though always the balance of capabilities matters a lot and it's very important, still, even not less important, and might be even more important, is to try to affect the rival's fundamental intentions by affecting potentially the regime of the rival. So the key distinction here is between focus and capabilities versus focus and intention, but intention in the sense of the long run, the basic fundamental intentions of your arrival. Then for the means of the policy, and especially use of force, the key distinction is between a kind of maximalist force building and potentially willingness to use force and to do it unilaterally, versus very cautious minimalist use of force and attempt to do it, if at all, to do it multilaterally. Then if we combine these two elements of the means and the objectives, we get the four grand strategies. Focus on the balance of capabilities in a maximalist way and willingness to use force unilaterally provides us with the offensive realist grand strategy that basically makes the argument that you cannot be secure in an anarchic international system without being the superior power. Only superiority over potential rivals guarantees your security. And especially if you're a great power, supposedly you might be able, or at least aspire to reach this level of superiority or hegemony. And in extreme cases, you might consider a unilateral resort to force, including a preventive war, especially vis-a-vis a rising power which might threaten your superiority. Defensive realists, however, oppose this logic. They basically argue that the more you try to maximize your power, it will lead to insecurity, it will lead to an arms race, and potentially to inadvertent escalation. So rather than focus on power maximization, the states focus on security maximization through balancing, deterrence, and even arms control, and here the potential element of multilateral in the sense of each state, or each great power more precisely, should secure its retaliatory capabilities, because then in times of crisis, no state will have the urge to fire first. The state will avoid the situation, the destabilizing situation of use it or lose it. And because of that, some levels of arms control might be useful to the extent they stabilize the military balance between the powers. If state resort to force, it will be more out of preemption, namely when there is an immediate and present danger to their security, and they are compelled by their situation, by the structure of the situation, to preempt, because otherwise they will be in an extremely insecure situation. Now moving to the two competing grand strategies which focus on the fundamental intentions of the rival, and I call them ideology promotion. And when we discuss the United States, we have the kind of the contrast between defensive versus offensive liberalism. But since I'm trying also to build a more general theory of grand strategy, obviously, if it's an illiberal great power, it won't engage with liberalism. It will be a fascist or Islamist or communist, or if it's China, maybe authoritarian capitalism, state capitalism, something like that. It will be liberalism. But if it's the United States, then the contrast between defensive versus offensive liberalism makes a lot of sense and extremely relevant, as we'll show about the post-Cold War era. The defensive ideology promotion, in general, without necessarily liberal great power, focuses on soft power and kind of appealing, power of appeal, and affecting, being very attractive, and so on, some level of international institutions, and diplomacy of conflict resolution. If it's a defense,
Dr. Miller?
Dr. Miller, you're muted. I think your mute got hit accidentally.
Okay, now it's okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ingrid. Okay, so defensive liberalism basically engages with the spread of democracy, free trade, building institution, and all of that by peaceful means. Offensive ideological promotion, however, emphasizes regime change through the use of force. Sometimes one might call it ideological crusade. If it's a liberal great power like the United States, then it's the offensive liberal grand strategy, which focuses on imposing the democratization and other, maybe to open their economies as well, and the United States rivals. Now, moving to the explanatory element, and then the application to the key changes since 1945, before we move later to the second decade of the 21st century with Obama and Trump and then Biden. Okay, let's put kind of the logic of the selection. I try to argue that the international system selects which grand strategy will dominate the day. So we have here two components of the international system: the global distribution of capabilities and the balance of threat. The distribution of capabilities selects which objective of the grand strategy will dominate the day, namely whether it will be a realist grand strategy or ideology promotion, which again, in the case of the United States, a liberal grand strategy. So variation in the distribution of capabilities decides actually if it will, about the objectives of the grand strategy, whether it will be a realist versus liberal in the case of the US. What about the balance of threat? Let me first, the distribution of capabilities is a little bit more clearer than the balance of threat and maybe a little bit less controversial. And the two kind of classical situation is either a great power parity, it can be bipolarity or multipolarity and so on, versus unipolarity. So that's fairly clear, more or less. The balance of threat might be a little bit more controversial. So let me specify the two necessary conditions for having high external threat. If one of them is missing, then it's a benign environment. For an anarchic international system, it's sufficient to become benign if one of the elements. So the two necessary components in order to have high external threat are the following one. Your rival is able to harm your key interest, your vital values, and it's clear that he's willing to do it, at least potentially. If one of these conditions is missing, namely the rival great power is able to harm you, but it's clear that it is unwilling to do it, or there is a rival that is willing to harm you very heavily, but it is unable to do it, then it's a benign environment. Okay, so what the balance of threat selects is actually the question of the means of the grand strategy, whether it will be offensive grand strategy or defensive grand strategy. And then the combined effect of the variation in the distribution of capabilities and the balance of threat provide the key conditions for the dominance of each one of the four grand strategies that we just discussed. Once we have a great power parity, it will be a realist grand strategy. What's the logic behind it? The logic is the compelling effect of the system. Once you have to confront a great power competitor, you cannot spend too much and too much scarce resources on affecting regimes and promoting your ideology and changing fundamental intention of the rival. You must focus first of all on the balance of power with your rival. And then the question, whether you do it in a more offensive realist superiority or more defensive realist balance and deterrence and so on. And that is brokered by the level of threat. Once it's a great power parity and you are confronting a high external threat, offensive realist is likely to dominate the day. If, however, it's a relatively benign, everything is anarchic international system is relatively benign environment, then defensive realist will have a great appeal, especially as we'll talk, for example, about the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in order to avoid an inadvertent escalation, which becomes then, in a benign environment, the key danger to the great power, rather than confronting a revisionist great powers, which really aims to harm you. What happens under unipolarity? Unipolarity provides the great power a great opportunity to promote its ideology. Why it's doing it? A number of logics. First of all, there is an ideological commitment probably. This great power has a strong belief in the appeal of its ideology. And having a unipolarity means that you have, at least it looks like you have a huge freedom of action in the international system. You don't have a countervailing coalition or countervailing force that constrains your ability to intervene everywhere in the international system. So that provides a great temptation to spread your ideology. It also holds a security logic, because if you make the other great powers, once they are relatively weak, in your own image, probably once they get stronger, supposedly they wouldn't pose a threat to you, because they will be anyway very similar to you, supposedly, definitely a liberal belief about that, and, democratic peace and so on, then will threat. So why not take advantage of the unipolarity in order to promote democracy, if you are obviously a liberal grand strategy, and then economic rationale for that, because it will, if you open markets and free trade and globalization, all of that stuff, supposedly will give a great opportunity to your big corporation, and also reduce the cost of consumer goods to your population and so on. So it's a great opportunity to spread your ideology, and particularly liberal ideology, if it's a liberal great powers, to spread it all over the world. And then the question, how to do it? To do it offensively, aggressively, or to do it defensively? And then comes the question of the balance of threat. Once it's a benign environment, you don't have any reason why to resort to force unnecessarily. Maybe limited use of force, as maybe the idea of humanitarian intervention, as we'll discuss, but not something major use of force. And so it will be kind of the defensive liberal grand strategy will dominate the day. However, when you are confronting what looks like a high external threat, then the offensive liberalism becomes attractive, and you are more willing to resort to force, even to massive use of force, in order to change the character of your opponent, if you believe that changing the character of your opponent will reduce the security threat that you are confronting. So let's now apply this logic to various key stages, key changes in American ground strategy. Actually, if we look at the period immediately after the end of the World War II, initially, still under the influence of FDR belief in the four policemen and great powers managing together the international system, international conflict, Truman actually wanted to continue that. This kind of in cooperation with the Soviet Union, as with other powers. But two changes happened in the following years. Changes both in the clarity of the distribution of capabilities and in the balance of threat that changed Truman's grand strategy, initially towards defensive realist, and later, particularly after the eruption of the war in Korea, into an offensive realist. And why did this happen? First of all, about the clarification of the distribution of capabilities. Whereas initially it looked like there are a number of great powers, all the winners of in the World War II, and they can cooperate and so on, it became quite clear that it's only the Soviet Union and the United States. It's only the United States that contain the Soviet Union. There's no other. Great Britain is bankrupt. there's no other partner that can help the United States and do a division of labor and so on. So it's the United States. But initially, George Kennan ideas about using containment, but doing it by political means and by economic means, for example, the Marshall Plan, establishing NATO as a diplomatic commitment to come to the help of Europe, made a lot of sense because it was more kind of the defensive realist agenda. Indeed, the Soviet looks more and more threatening, obviously taking over Eastern Europe, the question of Greece and Turkey and Iran and all of that, but it still looks like a defensive realism provided. And how do we know that? NSC 68 comes with a very hawkish agenda and prescribe a much higher defense spending and so on, but President Truman does not accept the recommendation of NSC 68. He's actually focused on the fair deal and investing a lot in American society, in American economy, is unwilling to follow the prescription of NSC 68. When NSC and the defense budget is only planned to be like something like $13 billion, which is much higher, obviously, in our terms, but in this time, but it still wasn't very high. Only after the invasion of North Korea to South Korea and the eruption, the onset of the Korean War, the United States embarked on offensive realist ground strategy, which means defense spending jumped immediately from 13 billions to 50 billions. And the United States changes completely its grand strategy. For the first time in American history, it adopts forward deployment, this huge deployment of American forces, particularly the Navy, but also military bases in different parts of the world. That was a huge change from the intention of FDR and Truman initially about returning the boys home from World War II back to the United States, and establishing also global alliances, completely different from George Washington advice to avoid entangling alliances. So the United States completely, drastically changed grand strategy, aiming to reach superiority vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in order to deter it, to contain it, changing its whole idea about American involvement. But my argument is that it happened only when it became clear that the Soviet Union, even if through its client, is willing to cross international boundaries. And my argument is that offensive crossing of international boundaries in the international system, which is composed of states separated by international boundary, is a major signal of high level of threat. Because if your opponent is willing, even though it's in Korea, in a relatively peripheral place at that time, to cross international boundary, maybe tomorrow it will try to do it in the border between the Germanies. So that means your opponent poses a high threat, and then the offensive realist and all grand strategy and all the huge investment related to it become much more attractive. And we see the gradual changes in Truman grand strategy. It didn't plan to follow these ideas, particularly NSC 68, before the eruption of the war in Korea. Now moving to the next big change is following the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what are the lessons for Kennedy that actually came initially, indeed, changing the grand strategy from massive retaliation to flexible response, but very much still in the style of offensive realist grand strategy. But what happens in the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though initially it looks like the Soviet Union is very aggressive and so on, what it becomes clear in these 13 days of the crisis is that actually the biggest danger to world peace, and particularly to American security, also to the Soviet, is inadvertent escalation. Because there were a lot of very frightening incidents during the crisis that showed very clearly that even though neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy are interested in World War III, definitely not, they are not completely able to control their military units or their allies, in the case of Castro and the Soviet Union. And the danger of inadvertent escalation becomes a very acute danger, and especially in nuclear age, obviously, the danger and the cost are very clear-cut. So following the crisis, actually Kennedy adopts some of the advice of defensive realist grand strategy, namely confident building measures like the hotline between the Kremlin and the White House, and starting a process of arms control, which then enhanced under Johnson, especially obviously under Nixon and Kissinger. But with this idea that developing, let's say towards the late 60s, the ideas of MAD, mutual assured destruction, that basically accept this idea that both superpowers have to feel secure about the survivability of their second strike capability in order to avoid use it or lose it situation, which can be very dangerous, and especially under inadvertent escalation, as we saw so many times during the crisis, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the defensive realist looks very promising. Carter comes with liberal ideas, let's say defensive liberal idea, cooperation with the Soviet Union, and arms control, and all of the joint resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict with the Soviet, and all of this stuff. But the more later in his administration, culminating again with a crossing of international boundary, when the Red Army crosses the international boundary between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan and invades Afghanistan, that clarifies to Carter that despite all his good intentions, at least in his eyes, the Soviet Union poses a major threat to world peace, the United States, to the West, and he adopts an offensive realist grand strategy. Huge jump in defense spending, the Carter Doctrine that commits the United States to protect the Persian Gulf, and the deployment and the buildup of the rapid deployment force. So Carter, which came actually with ideas of very dovish ideas, arms control and all the cooperation and all this stuff, moves to a much more hawkish offensive realist grand strategy. Reagan, initially, obviously, anti-communist for all his life and so on, is very happy to enhance this offensive realist grand strategy. But once it becomes clear to him, and maybe it became clear to him faster than to some of his advisors, that Gorbachev is a completely different leader in the Soviet Union, and that means the Soviet Union changes its security policy, its foreign policy, much more interested in the economic problems that it confronts, willing to reduce defense spending, and even to disengage from part of its sphere of influence. Reagan, which initially was very skeptical about arms control, adopts the idea of defensive realist arms control, and, for example, signs with Gorbachev in 1987, the INF Treaty, which actually Trump and Putin just a few months ago moved away from this intermediary nuclear forces agreement. So Reagan, the anti-communist and so on, adopts some of the ideas of defensive realists because the international environment changes, because Gorbachev and the Soviet Union are completely, at least in their foreign policy and the security policy, are completely different. When the Cold War ended, and more precisely, when bipolarity ended in the early 1990s, let's say December 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, and under the system shift to unipolarity, the attraction of the liberal grand strategy grows immensely. It starts even with Bush Sr., which is a classical realist, supposedly, in all his Skorkov and Baker and all his stuff. All the key people around him were very much kind of defensive realist or whatever in their orientation. But what is he doing towards the end of his administration? He's actually starting this type of use of force, very liberal use of force, humanitarian intervention. The United States intervenes in December or so 1992 in Somalia without any economic, strategic, security interest, any material interest in Somalia. It basically comes to do good. You know, we know what happened later on in the following year, what happened in Mogadishu, but the intention, at least of the United States, was to do good without any realist material interest. And that is doing it a very realist, supposedly in his worldview, a president like Bush Sr. And then this defensive realist grand strategy continue very strongly under Clinton with globalization, the attempt to liberalize the world, and particularly China, Russia, and the Muslim world become a key element in American grand strategy. And that can happen only because it's a unipolarity. Otherwise, the United States wouldn't dream about doing all this, attempting to do all these huge changes. And again, with regard to use of force, it's continuation and even some enhancement of the humanitarian intervention, which is a novel idea, actually, in international relations, because the United States intervened, for example, in the Balkans or in Somalia, also in Haiti, with regard to the Kurds and so on. For people who are completely, it's not American citizens, it doesn't have any material interest, major material interest in the Balkans, or again, in Somalia, and so on. And so the interest, even if we can find some realpolitik interest here and there, it's basically humanitarian. So it basically fits very nicely with liberal ideas, but it happens only because the international system allows this kind of intervention, because there is no countervailing coalition, and the United States can afford to intervene in the Balkans, an area which was under more or less kind of the Soviet sphere of influence during the Cold War, and the United States wouldn't dream about intervening militarily in this region. Okay, so so this defensive liberal is the dominant grand strategy for basically the 1990s. Then comes 9/11 and leads to what I call offensive liberal grand strategy. What is the logic behind it? The logic is obviously, according to the charter, is the high external threat. So people can ask, okay, Al-Qaeda, with all due respect, is not the Soviet Union, and so on. But still, because of the fear that this terrorist group, that definitely show its willingness to kill as many Americans as possible, and actually in 9/11, it shows some power projection capability. It reached New York City and Washington, D.C. And the fear of this group getting hold of chemical weapons, or God forbid, even something worse, definitely increases the level of threat in the eyes of many Americans, maybe the overwhelming majority of Americans, including in the junior Bush administration. The Bush administration came to power with a very realist agenda. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, maybe different variants of realism, but all of them kind of realpolitik type of people. But following 9/11, they change, the Bush administration, junior Bush administration, changes its policy, its grand strategy towards offensive liberal. Obviously, the key manifestation is Iraq, 2003, and partly also Afghanistan, at least the state building and the try to build democracy there. But obviously, Iraq is a key example of that, of imposing democracy on another country through the use of force. What is the logic of it and why it's related to 9/11? Obviously, there is a big debate about the causes of the Iraq War. What I'm trying to suggest here, that even though supposedly people can ask, this is liberalism, you come and impose another regime on a foreign country. In liberal view, liberals believe in the universal tenets of liberalism. It's not like Huntington with a Clash of Civilization that doesn't believe in the universal applicability of liberal ideas. Liberals believe that it's universal. The problem with Iraq is that there is a despot there, a tyrant there, that prevents these people from what they really want. What they really want, according to liberals, they want political freedom, economic freedom. That's a universal aspiration. So if the American military comes to Baghdad and deposes Saddam Hussein and establishes democracy, that indeed the United States has done it, even though the consequences were awful, obviously, in many respects, at least this imposing democracy in liberal view, it's liberating the people from a despot and giving them the opportunity to have democracy. And what's the relation between that and dealing with the terrorist threat of Al-Qaeda, the a liberal at least, or the liberal, or at least a liberal view here, is what is the best, most fundamental way to fight large-scale terrorism like Al-Qaeda? Okay, you can use military and police, intelligence means, and all of that is very important. But the most fundamental way to do it is to change the societies from where these people came. Indeed, they weren't Iraqis, the 19 kidnappers, but Al-Qaeda was an Arab organization. So the idea was that if you start in Iraq and democratize Iraq, and supposedly the belief was that it will be successful, then it will be a beacon of liberty for the whole Arab world, and all the Arabs will adopt democracy, and that will dry the swamp from which Al-Qaeda emerged in the first place. So that will be a fundamental blow to all of terrorism, much more effective than just using military and police and all these coercive means. So I think in liberal view, even though people can contest it and say that's imposing and so on, actually promoting democracy and even imposing democracy in the heartland of the Arab world might be a very effective way to fight terrorism and actually to end the terrorist threat in the most fundamental sense. So we see here again how external change, external threat in this respect, because definitely it comes from abroad, even though the kidnappers were in the United States for a while, but it's an external threat, changes the views of people who were before not liberal, definitely not in the grand strategy. They were much more realist, but after that adopt this idea, and whatever the effect, and they were extremely problematic, the effect of the American intervention in Iraq. But definitely the United States invested a lot, maybe too much, in building democracy in Iraq. And still to this day, there are elections, there is multi-party system. It's extremely problematic because of what Jack mentioned initially in the talk, the state to nation that we'll discuss, the state to nation problem in the Arab world in general, in Iraq in particular. But so it was but we shouldn't confuse between the intentions and the grand strategy of the United States and its effect. The effect were huge failure, but the intention was to build democracy, and there indeed was a huge investment in that, both in blood and in treasure, and democracy was established in Iraq, even though it's an extremely problematic and unstable democracy. Let's maybe now move maybe to Trump to how the okay, so here we have kind of a contrasting America first, nationalist grand strategy, particularly with the defensive realist, defensive, and obviously the differences with the various variants of liberalism are very clear, and obviously it's a completely different type of grand strategy, very illiberal, very unilateralist. So completely illiberal, there's no question about it. We saw Trump also domestically not such a great liberal, and definitely in his foreign policy and grand strategy. But it's also completely different from defensive realists, who are much more restrained and much more cautious with regard to use of force. And even though, indeed, nationalists are not necessarily in favor of major use of force unless there is it touches directly upon American interests, but the focus is more on definitely avoiding leadership and maximizing unilateral short-term material gains for the United States, and enhancing American freedom of action, both militarily and economically. A zero-sum approach, basically every bargain there is a loser and someone who gains, and the United States must always be the winner, even though including its allies might be the losers. And and actually even accepting the idea of preventive strike, even if on a limited extent, like what we say with Soleimani, the leader of the revolutionary guard, the Iranian, and taking a huge risk, by the way, that it might escalate with Iran, even though fortunately it didn't escalate with Iran. Then the question is what's the contribution of the international system, and more particularly the distribution of capabilities and the level of threat for the rise of nationalism, America first. First of all, about Obama, who came with a defensive liberal grand strategy, we see since, let's say, 2014, when the changes in the international system start, especially the rise of the others, particularly the rise of China, we see that Obama moves, even if gradually and partly, towards more defensive realist grand strategy with the idea of pivot to Asia. So the ideas of containing China, even if in a limited and slowly, start to emerge. But my argument about the kind of the international context for the rise of nationalism, America first, is the following one. Looking at this, the two key causal factors that I point out, the question of the distribution of capabilities and the level of threat. What happens with these two factors? With regard to distribution of capabilities, some level of power transition process in the international system start. Looking, for example, at power purchasing parity of China, it reaches more or less the level of the United States, even though in kind of real dollar still, it's only 2/3 of the American economy. But there is definitely some start of a power transition. What power transition means for the grand strategy? It means that the willingness to play the global leader in the liberal in the liberal view is declining in the United States. Once you are not the unipole anymore, once the structure of the system start to change in direction of some power transition, liberalism becomes less effective or less appealing, because the unipolarity is in some sense of decline, even if still the United States is the most powerful actor in the international system. It's not the kind of classical unipolarity that the United States enjoyed for quite a while after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then about the second causal factor, the level of external threat. What happened here is that maybe part of the kind of more general cleavages in American society, for the first time since 1945, a major disagreement about the issue of external threat, what is the key external threat confronting the United States, emerges in the following sense. Realists focus on China because it's the next most powerful actor in the international system. Liberals, however, on the other hand, focus much more on Russia. Both the oppression of dissidents in Russia, especially the violation of international norms, culminating with the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the intervention in Western democratic elections. Russia seems to be posing a major threat, at least to the liberal international orders in a liberal view. But there is also a third camp that emerges in the United States in the kind of second decade of the 21st century, focuses much more on the question of identity, migration, terrorism, and supposedly makes the connection between terrorism and migration, even if it's not completely accurate objectively, making this connection. Also question of trade and US as the sucker that is losing to allies and to trade partners and so on. And this view of America is to take care of only its interests, material interests, immediate sense, becomes also very prominent and producing the kind of the seeds for the rise of Trumpist America First. But the relevance of disagreement about the key threat means that realism is less effective under these circumstances. Because for realism, the realist grand strategy to be dominant, you need a clear-cut threat. There is more or less kind of an obvious agreement about, like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and maybe then the question of terrorism or the lack of threat during the 1990s, allowing for a liberal grand strategy. But disagreement about threat reduces the possibility for realist grand strategy, and since the power transition reduces the likelihood of liberal grand strategy, kind of the two classical American grand strategy, realism and liberalism, decline at least for a while. And now finally, about Biden. Let me share the screen. Okay, kind of summarizing very quickly the whole argument and then placing a potential Biden grand strategy there. Obviously, Cold War, leaving for a while the question of balance of threat. It's a realist grand strategy. You have a great power competitor. You are compelled by the international system to follow realist logic, focusing on the balance of power. The post-Cold War, a liberal hegemony, a liberal grand strategy, democracy, institution, trade, and globalization. Then the power transition and the disagreement over threats produces some of the conditions for the emergence of the nationalist America First, focusing on material gains in a zero-sum game. What might happen with Biden grand strategy? Again, looking at the two causal factors, the distribution of capabilities and the balance of threat. With regard to the distribution of capabilities, it's very clear. The rise of China, obviously, it's only China that matters in the broad sense of realpolitik. And you are compelled to follow realist grand strategies. Even though Biden was associated earlier with China joining the WTO, all this liberal globalization grand strategy, that will not be the guiding principle for his grand strategy vis-a-vis China. So in the geopolitical level, it will be realist. But in addition to the rise of China, there is another change that is taking place in the international system, and that involves the question of threats. There is a change in the sense that there is a major upgrading of transnational threats. Climate change, pandemic, and we can add non-proliferation, becoming more and more, there is a growing agreement that they are becoming a major threat, not only to the United States, obviously. These are threats to humanity, to all of humankind. And for that purpose, you must follow some element of liberalism, of international cooperation, and notably with China. Because without cooperation with China, you cannot cope with climate change, pandemic, and all these common threats. So the challenge of the Biden grand strategy will be how to reconcile a realist geopolitical grand strategy vis-a-vis a rising China and all its behavior in the South China Sea, Taiwan, and all of this stuff, with some elements of liberalism, of international cooperation, because the transnational threats become so predominant. Okay, I think I went a little bit even beyond the time allocation, so I'll be very happy to hear your questions, remarks, comments, and thank you very much for kindly listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Benny. That was such a well-organized talk that really did a great job of laying out the concepts and all the case studies. Even if you ran over a minute, it was still incredibly efficient. You covered so much that they might not even buy the book. I don't know. Good job.
Benny, can you turn off share screen so we can see you again?
Right. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So I'm going to do the usual thing and invoke the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. But, you know, while I'm asking my question, I'm going to invite everyone to raise their blue hand who wants to get in the queue. Benny, um, the book that strikes me as most similar to your book is John Lewis Gaddis' Strategies of Containment. It's a source that you're very familiar with, that you draw on a lot in the book, both for concepts and for interpretation of some historical periods. And so I want to ask you about some differences, though, between your explanation for the choice of strategy and also your coding of a couple of important Cold War periods as compared to Gaddis. Where you talk about offensive and defensive realism as strategies during the Cold War, Gaddis talks about symmetrical and asymmetrical strategies of containment. These are not identical concepts, but there's overlap between what you call offensive realism and what Gaddis calls symmetrical strategies of containment. For example, Paul Nitze, NSC 68. And there's overlap between your idea of defensive realism and asymmetric strategies of containment. The exemplar of that in Gaddis is George Kennan, the long telegram, and his particular strategy of containment, which emphasizes the importance of the main concentrations of industrial power in Eurasia, the Ruhr, and Japan, but not, the rice paddies of Vietnam, which he says are unimportant to the balance of power because there's no GDP there that's, worth fighting over. So Gaddis, like you, sees this variation over time between offensive and defensive, or symmetrical and asymmetrical containment. He has a different explanation than you do. His main explanation, as I understand it, bearing in mind that he's a historian and not a political scientist, but his main explanation is that the ambitiousness and aggressiveness of American policy is driven mainly by what he calls the perception of the available means to carry out the strategy. So his story for NSC 68 is that Paul Nitze is, hanging out at the water cooler in the White House, talking to the head of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president, a guy named Kaiserling. And Kaiserling is explaining to Nitze the principles of Keynesian economics, which says that you can run budget deficits and it's actually good for the economy. And Nitze says, that's a great idea, because if we can run budget deficits, we can have global symmetrical containment of communism, no matter how much it costs. And so this is a theme that Gaddis actually uses to explain all the variations between symmetric and asymmetric containment in all the different time periods. And, it's not a bad argument. So my first question is, how do you respond to that argument? Because it's completely orthogonal to the kinds of causes that you're talking about. But my second related question is about heightened threat as a trigger turning point in strategy. For example, Korea triggering NSC 68 as global assertive symmetrical containment. So if you're, the policy of the US in terms of the commitment to defend South Korea had been very ambivalent right up to the point when the North Korean tanks rolled across the border. So in a way, that fits your argument perfectly. Boom, there's the crystallization of the threat. It's contextualized, as you say, with a lot of other stuff that's going on. The Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, so it has the capability. The Soviet Union is messing around in all sorts of other places, Iran, Turkey, Greece. And so there's the intentionality that you talk about. So that does fit your theory very nicely. But I'm still interested in the specifics of the mechanism. So if you're a believer in the Kennan view of asymmetric strategies of containment, despite this, you're going to look at South Korea or Vietnam as places that don't matter at all for the balance of power in the world, because they have no industrial war-making capacity. They're just irrelevant. Korea is like close to the poorest country in the world at that time. So why bother to defend it? And so the fact that the threat is high still doesn't address the defensive realist or asymmetrical container view that you want to fight for the things that matter. You don't want to get tricked into fighting in areas where you're at a disadvantage and you're going to wind up spending blood and treasure stupidly, weakening yourself rather than succeeding. So just to wrap this up, Gaddis actually says that the period of Eisenhower and Dulles is a period of asymmetric containment. They're not pushing back with equal force, fighting wars everywhere, despite provocations in Dien Bien Phu, Quemoy and Matsu, Suez, Berlin, Cuba. Dulles and Eisenhower are responding at times and places of their own choosing that don't lead to big wars, but that shore up alliances and operate in a kind of what you might call defensive realist strategy. Yet you code them as, if I understand it right, as an offensive realist period, the same as NSC 68. So if you could comment about, you know, both in the causes and the outcomes, the places where you differ from Gaddis, and how you think about that.
No, Jack, these are excellent questions and very tough question. Yeah, first of all, I mean, obviously Gaddis doesn't have this because he's not a higher theorist, defensive versus offensive realist. So I wanted to tie this question of American grand strategy with kind of major IR theory debates and to specify them and to code them and so on. About this threat in Korea, supposedly my argument is since the international system is divided into independent states separated by border, kind of an aggressive crossing of international boundary, even if it is in a periphery, and it looks like it was a Stalin authorization, that it wasn't just a Kim family idea, that raises the level of threat. And supposedly, I could rely on the fact that Truman was resistant to adopting NSC 68 that came before the Korean War. And only after this crossing of it, aggressive crossing of the national boundary, he was willing to adopt it and indeed to start all this American global engagement, believing that it might also, this offensive crossing of international border might open also in Europe or in more important regions. So, and similarly, but then Carter and Afghanistan. So I think international boundary and crossing them signal something and raises the level of threat. About Eisenhower, first of all, it did rely supposedly on massive retaliation. So that means supposedly, superiority vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, especially in the strategic level. And in this sense, kind of the offensive realist that you have to be superior in order to deter your opponent, irrespective of all this, absolutely right, obviously what you said about avoiding this peripheral intervention. Even though he did intervene in Lebanon, in Jordan, Jordan was the British, but he supported in Lebanon and all this periphery that happens as well. But I more relied on the massive retaliation and having this, the basic idea of offensive realist, in order to secure yourself, you must be superior to your opponent, because otherwise you will be in an insecure situation. And I think Dallas and Eisenhower accepted that, this idea. While rejecting the offensive liberal of the rollback, they were in favor of superiority and deterring the Soviet Union by superiority. So in this sense, I think they fit the offensive realist grand strategy.
Great, thanks, Benny. Shmuel, I see your hand. Could you introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I hear. Okay, I'm Shmuel Yerushalmi from Belfer. I want to ask Benny next question. What do you think about imperialist policy of United States of America during all this period, since Truman period, after murdering of Roosevelt, and until today, because I see that the United States of America during last 75 years, this very serious imperialistic force that trying to control all world, all policy and the life of all states around the world. And I want to ask you to expand on this question.
Yeah, that's a tough question, brother. I don't think it's an accurate description. I think during the Cold War, basically the idea was that the Soviet Union poses a major threat to the West, and the United States provides a protection to the West against potential Soviet aggression, and the rising threat posed by the Soviet did provide credibility to this idea. And I think after the end of the Cold War, the intention were good. The implementation was very problematic and led to all kind of unintended outcomes. But the intentions of the United States were definitely, I think, on the whole, very good. The problem was in the implementation and the unintended consequences of that.
Okay, thank you. So the floor's open. Raise your hand if you have a question or comment. While I'm waiting to see someone with their hand up, I will once again assert the prerogative. Benny, your conceptual setup. Oh, well, there's Rick Herman. My question can wait. Rick always has good stuff to say. So Rick, you have the floor. Rick, unmute yourself.
I'm Rick Herman from Ohio State. Benny, we know each other, so
Sure.
I agree very much that capability matters, and so when we think about dealing with Iraq or Iran, a full-scale regime change is possible. But when we think about dealing with China or Russia during the Cold War or after, those are simply not options that are on the table. It's much too dangerous. And that was, I think, going back to Kennan, one of Kennan's key points. You can't confront the Soviet Union head on. It's a populist driven state, and that will only inflame nationalism. So you have to contain it. And it was designed to change the internal character of the communist regime over time. And what I miss in your explanation, or I'd like to hear you, is that you don't seem to take into account the nature of the other and beliefs about its mutability. So for instance, let's look at US and China in the last 20 years, we've had engagers sort of in charge, not because they think they're liberals. I think they believed that China was potentially mutable through an engagement strategy, and the nature of the regime might evolve over time. Now, 20 years later, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And so there's much greater pessimism now about the mutability of the Chinese regime, and we may shift. Now, coterminous with that, there's been a change in the balance of power. I mean, there's a rising China. But it seems that in much of your theorizing of, and when you get to the cases, the explanation of the cases tends to often be an explanation of people's beliefs about the nature of the other and its mutability. I mean, that's what separated Kennan from Kissinger. Kennan believed the Soviet Union over time would be changeable. Kissinger did not. Kissinger believed it was a fixed system that would always be that. So for Kissinger, the best we could hope for was containment and the stabilization of the nuclear balance. For Kennan, there was a belief that over time you have a strategy that could create change in the nature of the regime. And I'm wondering where that sense of dynamism comes. You know, currently we used to think, and maybe some still do, that we can change China over time. Others think it's just immutable and attack. So that's my first sense, is where does the beliefs about the nature of the other fit into your scheme, or is it entirely a structural scheme? And the second thing that I sensed, I don't see in your construction of strategy any downstream sort of plays 5, 6, and 7. They all seem like descriptions of single shot strategies that only assume we're going to do this in a particular time period. There doesn't seem to be any built-in expectation about how the other is going to respond in a more game theoretic sense of strategy, so that we'd be thinking of how do these strategies differ when they're looking 5, 6 plays down the stream. There doesn't seem to be any downstream in your conception of strategy. Am I missing that?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, great questions. No, I think the argument is, once you confront a great power competitor, you must follow realpolitik grand strategy. You don't have much choice. Then, when you are the hegemon, when it's unipolarity, you basically think that that's a great opportunity to promote your ideology in its various ways, political, economic, and so on. And that's what the United States tried to do in a kind of defensive liberal fashion, especially during the 1990s. But with regard to China, continue with that, culminating with the WTO in 2001, believing, according to liberal beliefs, that it's just a question of time. When you become a country become richer, like what happened in Europe after the Industrial Revolution, it will gradually, even if it takes time, democratize and become more and more pacific in its foreign policy. So basically, and also there will be obviously economic gains for cooperation and for the American consumer and all of that. So I think the logic was very clear. It was very liberal. My idea is the following one. Once it's a great power competitor, ideology doesn't matter so much, at least in your grand strategy. Once you are the hegemon, then ideology moves to the front seat and becomes a very important component in your grand strategy. And that's precisely what happened after the end of the Cold War and under unipolarity. The United States defensively tried to change Russia and China and so on. And with the liberal belief that indeed it will work out, and it fits perfectly with liberal theory, and also with the, more or less the historical experience of Europe, even if we can debate that. So I think that was but the logic of my argument is that changing international system affect in major way the type of your grand strategy, moving from realist to liberal in the case of the United States.
Thank you. Okay, so floor's open again. once again, I'll try to squeeze in my question while you're formulating yours. So, Benny, there's Ray on the Saltzman staff preempting me. Okay, you got it, Ray.
Thank you, professors. Professor Miller, my question to you is, given the Biden administration coming on board during this in January, and the shift from a more, I guess, like America First policy by the previous administration, how do you expect, especially like U.S. and China and U.S.-Israeli relations to improve or not improve? Just a quick question for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, about China, I try to make the argument that since the world is moving more or less towards a kind of a bipolar, even though it would be completely different from the US-Soviet bipolarity, and the whole, in the realpolitik field, it will be a very realist strategy vis-a-vis China, but it will be constrained by the need to cooperate with China and the rising transnational threats, because you cannot deal with climate or with pandemic or even with non-proliferation without cooperation with China. So that will be a major challenge, how to reconcile these two different strategies. But I think both of them makes a lot of sense with regard to overall Biden's strategy. But obviously it will be the Biden, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that is looking forward to China joining the WTO and then changing and all of that. That's probably part of the past. That wouldn't be the future of Biden grand strategy. But with regard to these transnational threats, there will be definitely a focus on some level of cooperation with China. About Israel, I think definitely there will be a major change from the Trump, because Trump was actually because of the evangelist and because of Edelson, his big contributor, was completely basically subordinated to Netanyahu, and he has done basically whatever Netanyahu wanted in every foreign policy respect that is related to Israel. Obviously, Biden is not completely committed to all these audiences, and the strategy will be different. And the difference will be, with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian, now moving back to the two-state solution, but I think with a lower profile than earlier American commitment. But the two-state solution will be back in center stage with regard to Palestinian, even if there will be no major investment. Then about Iran, obviously, rather than withdrawal from the agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement, there will be a major attempt to renew the agreement. It's very difficult because of the question, what will come before? First, the sanction, removing the sanction, or Iran coming back to its commitment, and all of that. It will be extra, and definitely Israel and the Gulf states will pose major resistance to a restoration of the agreement, but the attempt of the administration will be to restore, and obviously Israel wouldn't be this key player that affects every move that the administration is doing in the Middle East, even though there's still Israel will be taken into account. And I think the difference is, hopefully democracy will remain in Israel alive and well, as opposed to the allies of Israel, the new allies, Saudi Arabia and all of that. There will be no condemnation of Israel, hopefully, at least not in Israel proper, and human rights and all of that. Maybe with regard to Palestinian, which is more problematic.
Thanks, Professor. I have just one quick follow-up to that. So everything I just asked you, but can you include Russia in that too, like in terms of great power competition? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously there will be a big change from Trump with regard to Russia. We already see that, even though, again, there is a need to cooperate with regard to arms control, and there is also already a renewal of the New START nuclear agreement. But Biden will be subordinated to Putin like what Trump was. So definitely a major change in relation to Russia, which poses a major threat to liberal democracies, not only in Russia itself, but in its neighborhood, but all over the world, with all its intervention in elections and all the cyber warfare and so on. And Biden will be much more hardliner. that. But I think from a strategic overall view, the focus is on China because China is so powerful and Russia is on the whole much weaker than China.
Thanks, Professor.
You're welcome.
As I understand it, we're scheduled to stop at 1:30. Is that right, Ingrid? But I can't resist getting my last question in for what's hopefully a short question, short answer. So I was happy to see that you classified Biden as possibly partly a realist, but possibly partly a liberal. And one of the things that I noticed in your rollout of the rest of the history was that you were forcing us to choose. Is this a liberal strategy or is this a realist strategy? Fine, you get to define your terms, you're the theorist, but I like to think of liberal great powers as the best realists. Britain and the United States always come out on the winning side of the big hegemonic struggles among the great powers. I think that's because they're both liberal and realist, whereas the authoritarian regimes are both illiberal and they're terrible realists. They attack everybody, make everybody their enemy, and wind up losing in a decisive defeat. So my question is, what about this category of liberal realist strategy? Is there such a thing? And is it, as I believe, a really good strategy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think what is going on is that there are now two domains kind of broadly in international politics. Still, the kind of geopolitical and all that is still very important. And obviously, China's assertive, even aggressive behavior in its neighborhood compels Biden to respond, and also in the economic, technological stuff. So in this sense, it's kind of the realpolitik, the realist. But at the same time, this big change of upgrading of the transnational threats, maybe the first time the sense and the pandemic reinforced it, that there are threats to common to all of humanity, you must have some liberal component of focusing on international institutions, WHO, and all of that, and international cooperation. So I think in this sense, there is kind of, there will be a focus on trying to reconcile the two, but at the same time to going a little bit in two directions, and the geopolitical field, realist, and on the transnational liberal. It's not easy, but that is the obvious challenge that Biden is going to confront.
Okay, Catherine Moore has a question.
Yes, because you rightfully brought up Britain and the United States, I'm fascinated by Biden's commitment to not having the reestablishment of a land border on Northern Ireland. And yet Boris Johnson's people in Northern Ireland are starting problems by negating the water border that sort of replaced the land border. And that brings up the liberal American view and the more pragmatic. And I'm curious how Biden will deal with that, because he has a
Catherine, we lost you somehow. But Benny, it was a good question because it raises the question of lack of congruence between state and nation in Northern Ireland. So she found your sweet spot.
Right, absolutely, Jack, you're absolutely right. Obviously, the Northern Ireland crisis or conflict was all about this state-to-nation imbalance, and that still poses a major challenge. But Biden himself, since he's from Irish origin, probably feels some sympathy to the Irish people, and but at the same time, he's also very a completely different view of the EU than Trump, that was completely hostile to the EU and the whole idea of integration and so on. And Biden is much more favorable to it. So in this sense, a bit of a change in the relation between Britain and Ireland and the balance between the two.
Yeah, that's true. You know, the big imbalance in the Irish state and nation is that most Irish are actually in the United States of America.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have reached our witching hour. So Benny, thank you so much for such a clear and succinct and convincing explication of your new book, which fortunately I already have my copy, but everybody else in the room should go out and buy it. So
Thank you very much, Jack. It was great, and your questions were excellent. And thank you very much, the audience and Ingrid, for organizing and setting up such a nice setting, even though it's on Zoom. So thank you very much. It was a great pleasure and a great honor, and I learned a lot. So I hope you also all benefited. Thank you very much, and looking forward to our future cooperation.
Yes, thank you. And I hope you can join us again soon. Thank you,
Sure.
sir.
thank you, Benny.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much.